Welcome everybody. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to CND's webinar this sunny day, or at least it's sunny in London. The subject we're discussing today is UK attachments to nuclear power and military romance. We're very pleased to be joined today by two eminent experts in this field. Our guests are Professor Andy Stirling and Dr. Phil Johnstone. Andy is a Professor of Science and Technology at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. He served as an advisor to the EC, UK and other governments across a range of issues in the politics of science, technology and innovation. Dr. Phil Johnstone is a Research Fellow at the Science Policy Research Unit at the University of Sussex. Phil has been a member of the Sussex Energy Group since 2013, and he's researched and published on a number of topics related to energy transformations, and he has a long-standing interest in nuclear power policy. Now, I think we're probably all aware that there's a very close interrelationship technologically between nuclear weapons industry and nuclear power industry. They do share technology, and I think probably most people know that the UK's first nuclear power stations were built primarily to provide fissile material for nuclear weapons. But I think many people perhaps think that this was a past relationship and the two industries are no longer linked. But it now appears that the government is using the Hinkley Point C nuclear power station to subsidise Trident, Britain's nuclear weapons system. There was recently a parliamentary investigation into the Hinkley project, and it emerged that without billions of pounds earmarked for building this new power station in Somerset, Trident would be, quotes, insupportable. So this is a big and controversial issue, and Andy and Phil, our guests today, have argued that Hinkley C will, quotes, maintain a large-scale national base of nuclear-specific skills essential for maintaining Britain's military nuclear capability. So really showing clearly the links between those two industries. So we're really delighted to have both of them here with us today to discuss this crucial issue. Our other guest is Professor Dave Webb. He's chair of CND, and he's going to discuss the issues with Andy and Phil in the first half of the webinar. And then when they finish their conversation, we'll take audience questions and comments. So please, for that purpose, use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. So thanks everyone again for joining us. Over to you, Dave, to put your first question to our experts.
Thanks very much, Kate. Thanks for the introduction. And Andy and Phil, welcome, and thanks for coming along.
Thank you.
So let's start, first of all, with Andy. Maybe you could tell us a bit more about your project. And as Kate said, we've known about the connections between nuclear weapons and nuclear power for a long time. What's so specifically different about your findings?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right. The general links with between nuclear power and nuclear weapons have been known for an awfully long time, right back to the very beginning, and organisations like CND have done a fantastic job over the years in exposing all kinds of linkages of that kind. But in the past, it's been the case that the kinds of linkages that are most attended to are fissile materials, other special nuclear materials, as Kate alluded to, coming out of some British reactors in the past. But now, with the somewhat downscaled size of the nuclear arsenal, although that may well be going up again, and the passage of so many years, that's not such a pressing issue now as it has been in the past. And so if you listen to the debates on this nuclear weapons and nuclear power on either side, they tend to have become a little bit separated recently. A lot of organisations that used to work on both no longer do, for instance. And what Phil and I have been really, we've really been taken aback ourselves by how intense this signal is, if you really look for it, is that the link now is not about special materials, it's about industrial base. As Kate alluded to, it's about skills, it's about university departments, it's about research capacities, it's about special kinds of metals and engineering companies. If you want to maintain, and it's not the nuclear weapons so much, it's the nuclear propelled submarines. if you want to be a country that can build in your own country one of the most complex, if not the most complex artifact ever developed, a nuclear propelled submarine, then you need an industrial base to do that. And they have not costed that in. They've just costed in submarine by submarine, and even then a little bit romantically. So basically, if you want to be able to build nuclear propelled submarines, and the British government seems to want that quite badly, then you know you need consumers to be paying for very expensive electricity with the money trickling down into that industrial base from the consumer side to keep that industry alive. Otherwise, it's not feasible.
Thanks, Andy. So Phil, we've been told time and again that we need nuclear power in order to cope with climate change. Is that not the case then?
Well, thanks for the question, Dave. I think, there is a lot of well-informed people that put this argument forward that nuclear is needed for climate change. And it is indeed the case that nuclear is lower carbon than coal and gas. But the crucial thing is we need to look at how much it costs and how fast it can be deployed. And what we see with the cost reductions in renewables and the rapid construction programs that have occurred over the past 20 years is that renewables are a far faster and cheaper way to reduce emissions. And given what we've been told about the urgency of climate change and so on, it's increasingly clear that you need to put the money into renewables if you want to act fast on climate change. To put it into nuclear is to divert precious resources from solutions like renewables and energy efficiency to nuclear that takes a long time to build and is very expensive. And for a very real example, we can look at what we've experienced here in the UK and look at what was promised about nuclear being built significantly before 2025 to reduce emissions. It simply hasn't happened, as is the case in France, Finland, and the USA in terms of the nuclear renaissance, whereas renewables have been built rapidly and cheaply.
Thanks very much, yeah. And so, Andy, could you go into a bit more about the evidence that you found for the links between the military and civil nuclear power systems?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. That was a dangerous question for people like Phil and I, because we'll happily chunter on for ages. But what really has taken us aback and amazed us is quite how much evidence there is if you look for it. What's amazing at the moment is how little in the media, in NGOs, people are actually looking for this. So on the defence side, there's absolute reams of it. There's all kinds of grey literature, evidence of select committees, comments by professional organisations, academic organisations, industry. Rolls-Royce, the key company building the submarine reactors for the BAE Systems submarines themselves, are just absolutely open about this link. Specifically, in order to build nuclear propelled submarines, you need this industrial base. So there's no contest in the defence literature, if you look for it. But on the civil energy side, there's absolutely nothing. And that's really striking. What we think that's one of the biggest issues here. We can maybe unpack that a little bit later. But what we have done, largely, to be honest, Phil and I weighing in on energy select committees and in relations to bodies like the National Audit Office and so on, slowly evidence has begun to be conceded very grudgingly. So we've had the NAO and the PAC, Public Accounts Committee, challenge on the basis the government for the lack of an energy case. What is the case? Government hasn't yet come back. But off the record, in exchanges we've had, it's quite clear that these bodies know there's quite a lot going on. And if you look at the footnotes, you can see the National Audit Office has really put the case together quite well. They just aren't able to state it, which really one might view as quite sinister. And under questioning in the Parliamentary Public Accounts Committee on evidence that Phil and I submitted, Mr. Stephen Lovegrove, the secretary, the principal, secretary at the Ministry of Defence now, has openly acknowledged. He said, if we weren't attending to this link, we wouldn't be doing our jobs. So what's remarkable is how clearly it has been acknowledged, but how little attended to is in public debate, given the massive financial implications.
I guess we can get some of those links that you're talking about from your reports. Is there a simple way of saying how you get hold of your reports? Or they're on the web somewhere, I guess?
Yeah, there's a website at Sussex. I haven't got the URL in my head. We can obviously give it to you. You can post it with the bump from this discussion. And we really welcome people engaging, coming in with comments. We've got a website that pulls together all the evidence and reaches out into all the sort of techie details at the University of Sussex SPRU, Science Policy Research Unit website. We'll send a URL to you so you can post it with this.
Great, thanks, yeah. So Phil, why should all of this really be of any concern to UK citizens?
Well, depending on the details and so on, which because of the transparency issues, we can't put exact figures on, but the amount of money we're talking about here in terms of cross subsidy from civil energy bills to the military is looking like the tens of billions of pounds mark. And this is a lot of money. And this is a lot of money that's being invested in the nuclear sector and for the point of not just energy policy, but in sustaining military-related capabilities. And I think at a time when UK could be really benefiting from a renewables revolution, you know, the UK is in a fantastic place in terms of having the best renewable resource in Europe. An extraordinary number of jobs could come from the renewable sector. At a moment like this, this kind of diversion to nuclear infrastructures in general, both civil and military, is really going to slow down the potential for the UK to accelerate towards a renewables future. And this one thing to point out is that you don't need to be anti or pro-nuclear to have a stake in this issue, because really what it comes down to is it's a matter of UK democracy. What we have here is a situation where money is being diverted from civil to military nuclear infrastructures, and it is not being discussed. And in a functioning democracy, it should be discussed. So really what the main issue here is about is it reveals something about rigor and democratic accountability within the UK system.
Yeah, thanks, yeah. But Andy, you've alluded to, both of you have alluded really to a kind of almost a cover-up of this kind of, this sort of link. Isn't this just like a conspiracy theory, or I mean, what makes you really believe in what you're saying there?
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting. We've been at this now for 4 years pretty much, and being accused of being conspiracy theorists is one of the two ways in which we tend to be, when we're being dismissed. Most of the time we actually get ignored. That's the experience with a lot of other academics in the field and with a lot of specialist journalists whose livelihoods depend on clientship with people like the Department of Energy, as well as all the energy system. But so we get accused of conspiracy theory quite often. No one has ever refuted any part of our argument in substance. But they do sometimes dismiss it that way, as well as just dismissing it, saying, well, everyone knows that. It's kind of almost like a contradictory alternative way of dismissing it. But what we're certainly, the dynamics we're pointing to certainly do involve covert processes. So what's effectively happening is a large part of the costs, the indirect costs of maintaining the British so-called deterrent, is kept off the Ministry of Defence budget, actually kept off public spending generally because it's being channeled from electricity consumers, and thereby also kept out of public scrutiny. So as a result, no one knows exactly what these costs are because they're being channeled in an effective subsidy. So that is a covert process, but I don't think it's actually being engineered. I'm not sure the British government is capable of such a phenomenal conspiracy in a sort of over many years in a sort of narrow individual sense. I think it's just structural pressures are leading to that, and the depth of the commitment in Whitehall to the nuclear weapons status of Britain and what that means on the international stage means they just don't see an alternative. So it's a covert process. It's not a narrow conspiracy. It's structural pressures, but the cost to consumers and as Phil said, to British democracy is pretty much the same.
Mm. Yeah, interesting. So Phil, do you think it's not a bit simplistic to sort of say or suggest that the military links are actually driving the civil nuclear power program?
Well, this is another interesting reaction that we've had. And if you think about what Andy was just saying, it's quite interesting that we get these two reactions. One is it's a conspiracy theory, or, well, it's obvious. So that's quite interesting in and of itself. We've always been very clear to state that this is one among a variety of factors. You know, we've always made sure that we make people aware that we are aware. Sorry, my video's just cut out. That there's a lot of complexity and diversity and uncertainty with regards to the drivers behind civil nuclear. But the point that we've been making, whilst a number of these different things have been looked into, be it climate change and the economics and all these different factors looking at the drivers, what hasn't really been looked at and what has really been concealed and neglected is the military-related driver. As Andy's mentioned previously, it's not discussed in energy policy or really in energy research as well. So that's the point we've been making. It's not the only factor, but it is one that's been neglected within current discussions.
Mm. So back to you, Andy. Why is it, do you think, that this discussion is not happening more widely? So in Parliament, in academia, in various think tanks and so on associated with nuclear systems. Just why isn't this conversation being carried out, happening?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It is slowly getting more so. I mean, for instance, this discussion now, it's slowly becoming more attended to. And we've been told now by too many people to count who were initially saying things, quite skeptical things to us. Well, if this were true, it would be all over the place. And they're now saying, specialists in the field, okay, I'm sorry, actually, I was wrong to be as critical and dismissive earlier, because it clearly is a big issue. So it's slowly happening. We get that much more on an individual basis than we do on an organizational basis. So it's still the case, and I alluded to the kind of pressures on journalists. I think the clientship process for journalists, who are otherwise, very good people doing their job, like, do they want to risk their sources of information in the establishment by coming out with things that are very seriously inconvenient? And Phil and I have had tastes of quite how very seriously inconvenient this storyline is for the establishment, for obvious reasons. It's why is it so little discussed? I think it's basically like a gravitational field, that we live in a political culture in the UK that really, I mean, people in CND know this better than most and better than me, many people, it's quite an eccentric political culture. The status of the country, this post-imperial status, is really, really strong. All political persuasions are influenced by it. Phil and I have gone back through energy policy since the Blair government and seen, I mean, it's too detailed to go into now, but just a number of times that really extraordinary moves have been made to cover this up, to justify nuclear with no kind of attention to it. And then the acquiescence of public officials and public agencies, even NGOs. No, we've been told this by leading NGOs who one would expect to be critical, that, well, yeah, you're right, but this isn't a good thing to raise. We weren't going to win an issue with the great British public by talking about this. We've had public officials, senior public officials, say to us, as a professional, I have to remain silent on what you've done. But as a citizen, I'm extremely glad you're doing it. That's a verbatim quote from one senior official who we promised not to quote. So this kind of dynamic is really deeply entrenched around Whitehall. And this is what's causing it. So that's why, as Phil said earlier, it really isn't about being pro or anti-nuclear power or nuclear weapons. It is a very serious pathology in the British political system, extending right out from Parliament into the media, into the think tanks as well, that they're not able to discuss this openly, because it's far from clear. You don't necessarily conclude, let's stop nuclear weapons from this or nuclear power. You could say, yes, let's go for it. It's just we're not talking about it. And that's what really is so unhealthy.
Yeah, I think we've been in CND and various other kind of nuclear disarmament sort of campaigns. It's become clear that the argument for retaining nuclear weapons is becoming very flimsy, very thin. I mean, what's the point? They're extremely expensive. They're, you can't use them really. It's just stupid. And so I think a lot of us have come to the conclusion it's a status thing. It's a thing that keeps, or at least politicians think it keeps the country at a particular status level, and they don't want to relinquish that. But it's such a cost as well. I mean, we don't need nuclear weapons. We probably don't need nuclear power, and yet they're extremely costly. Yeah. So, Phil, is this just unique to the UK, or is this happening elsewhere in the world? Maybe not to the same extent, but what do you think?
Well, we can definitely see a pattern in particular countries that have very ambitious new nuclear build programs tend to be nuclear weapon states or aspiring nuclear weapon states. And this is something we've documented in one of our working papers, which, you know, we can also share. You know, there's a lot of evidence. And one interesting moment was 2017, and this was after we'd published our initial paper on this. And in 2017, in the USA, some key reports by Ernest Moniz, who is the former Energy Secretary in the US, came out. And this stated clearly that if the civil nuclear industry in the USA declined, this would be disruptive for the US naval nuclear power and nuclear weapons system. And it made it extremely clear, the links. It said the supply chains are linked. It said they're interdependent. It said that the military needs civil nuclear. Couldn't be clearer. And we have statements from France, from Brazil, from Russia, from China. It's all very clear. And as I say, it's all documented in our paper. But I think our focus on the UK perhaps is, you know, what it draws out is, again, coming back to that democratic issue that the UK is very much committed to, obviously, policy rigor and accountability and democracy and these kind of traditions that it often sees itself as being a bastion of. And what we see with this issue, and the fact that it's not being discussed, and the fact that it's not being scrutinized in the usual parliamentary procedures, is that there is a serious democratic failing at play with this. But absolutely, it is a global pattern, and it's becoming more clear as time goes on.
Yeah, I think it might be worth discussing briefly about the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was due to be discussed again this year in New York, but obviously the coronavirus has prevented that. I think it may happen beginning of next year. But one of the pillars, the three pillars of the Non-Proliferation Treaty is to, you know, not freely exchange, but yeah, freely exchange the nuclear power aspects of the industry. I mean, do you think that's a failing of the treaty, or either of you, or is that something that you know you can, okay, spread nuclear power a bit, but you don't have to worry about it generating nuclear weapons?
Well, I could have a bash at that. I think it's absolutely core to the problem. It's been well known in general, right, going back looking at all kinds of industries, how it's typically the case that regulatory regimes, whether they be health and safety or environment or indeed proliferation like this case is, are best understood. The way they act is best understood not as a way of actually holding business to account, but protecting the largest firms against smaller ones that will come in. That regulation is part of an industrial regime, and that's not a nuclear thing, it's a general feature of regulatory capitalism. And so it's true in this area. And what's remarkable is a number of organizations that have this hardwired, since the 50s, dual promotional and supposedly regulatory function on nuclear. It's really amazing how they are sustained. Nuclear Energy Agency, Euratom, IAEA to name the organization under the international proliferation regime. And it's really clear that the whole formula for nuclear proliferation is to actually very intensely, there is no technology backed by UN agencies so strongly as nuclear power is, and yet it's obsolete. It's effectively obsolete in the sense that now it's just beyond debate. It's so manifestly more expensive than other low carbon alternatives that it is obsolete in that sense. And yet it has this international agency pursuing it, supposedly to protect us from the weapons that intrinsically depend on it. So we really have a Kafkaesque situation here, and we have to deal with these international regimes. The NPT is definitely part of the problem, and the IAEA are part of the problem rather than part of the solution. And a lot of the disarmament organizations, I say, I mean, just for a discussion point, that have sensed, and it's especially true in the USA, it's not true of CND, especially particular episodes, but that in order to take on nuclear weapons, you have to somehow say, look, don't get me wrong, I'm not against nuclear power, and almost have to sort of go through a ritual of acknowledging nuclear power, which is quite a shallow analysis, I think, of how to get rid of nuclear weapons. Because the opportunity now is they're simply going obsolete, just like other types of weapons went obsolete in the past. And unless we really directly address this issue, we're going to be missing a chance.
Yeah, thank you very much. Kate, I guess there are some questions coming in.
Okay. Thanks very much. That's very stimulating, and I'm glad you accepted CND from that, your final point there, Andy. Of course, we are absolutely militantly against both, and can't understand why all anti-nuclear organisations wouldn't be militantly against both. Okay, so we've got lots of questions coming in. You've stimulated a lot of thought. Obviously, they've been coming in during the course of your answers, so some of them will relate to points that you made earlier on. So first of all, from Linda Rogers. Linda says, is the argument we need to be putting then that the submarines are redundant now because they are no longer able to move around without detection, etc.? So who would like to respond to that? Andy, you're nodding.
Yeah, well, sure. I always nod though, so
Oh, okay.
I'm enthusiastic on these issues. But anyway, yes, that is. I mean, that's a site I mentioned just at the end there. The obsolescence. We talked about it with nuclear power because it's so much more expensive than other low carbon technologies. And I'm sure many people in this discussion know better than us that transparent oceans phenomenon, that the non-detectability of the nuclear-propelled submarine is now at least in serious question, and even conservatively looking prospectively for the investments that are now being made in a new generation of nuclear-propelled submarines. That really is highly problematic, both with signal processing from satellites, detection in the oceans, and also with drone technologies. There's a whole host of things called transparent oceans that are arguably making nuclear submarines obsolete. And of course, that's not CND's basis. It happened not to be my basis for the real commitment of skepticism against nuclear weapons, to put it mildly. But nonetheless, it's a really important political juncture we're at now, that is in fact happening, which helps the argument that's always been made on other grounds. So I wouldn't say the key of our argument is to say get rid of submarines because they're not working. It's just pointing out to the fact they're only staying in place because it's entrenched lock-in going on in countries like the UK, which are not listening to evidence either from the energy side or from the military side. Just like in the past, military technologies have carried on well after their sell-by date, even for military proponents. They outlive their so-called usefulness, and that's the case now. Yeah,
absolutely. So in the Zoom chat, there's a question from Robert Idris about the company that's got a contract for coolant loops. Don't know if one of you is able to respond to that in the chat. I've got another question which could also be responded to in the chat. This is from Ian Rawls from Friends of the Earth Nuclear Network. He's asking if you could share the link that you mentioned. I think it's around Harrington when he was energy minister. He's saying his memory is that he was flat out denying any link whatsoever. So if you could share links perhaps in chat, that would be very helpful. And then, so the next actual question, this is from Ray Street. Ray says, what do we do about the trade unions? For example, Unite has recently declared its support for Sizewell C. And of course, we know that the TUC has policy in support of Sizewell C. Phil, would you want to?
Yeah, sure. This is a really interesting question because it is the case that trade unions are one of the major sticking points when it comes to the continuation of nuclear power, and we see that for the reasons that have just been mentioned. But in our research, what really came out was unions in the Barrow shipyards, the Keep Our Future Afloat campaign, are a very strong political coalition that have put pressure on sustaining nuclear submarines, nuclear weapons, and civil nuclear, of course, for the reason of jobs, and often in very interesting alliances for trade unionists. I think, for example, what I find interesting and revealing is when the industrial strategy was proposed, one of the first sector deals that was immediately agreed really was the nuclear sector deal with the Nuclear Industry Council, where the head of Prospect Union was put at the table with politicians. And this is at a time where unions have been excluded from UK political life during the last 10 years in many ways. But the exception again seems to be nuclear. And I think that's very interesting. But what do we do about the unions is that we need to just start having the conversation, because from what some of my trade union friends tell me is that the real challenge is to actually just get these issues on the table, because they can be quite fiercely resisted. And, I think it's very clear if you look, and CND's obviously done amazing work on this, on the jobs and how many jobs there actually are and so on in relation to nuclear weapons and indeed the submarines. But on the civil nuclear side as well, the Office for National Statistics back in 2014 was already pointing out that there's more direct jobs from renewables. And that's only going to increase as renewables increase. And nuclear markets are shrinking. Export opportunities are shrinking. Renewable markets are booming. The UK has a fantastic opportunity for renewables with the best resources I've mentioned. And the potential for jobs from renewables is vast. And what we're going to see is, if we continue with the nuclear front, is that UK workers are going to miss out on the opportunity to fully benefit from those jobs, because the unions spend so much time trying to protect a relatively small number of jobs in the nuclear sector. So it's a very difficult issue. It's about getting that conversation going, and it's an uphill battle, but it's one that has to happen for the good of energy policy, but in my opinion, for the good of the UK trade union movement as well.
Okay, so the questions are really coming in now. So I've got a comment from David Lowry, which I'll read out, and if you want to comment on his thoughts on this, please do. He says, in the early 1960s, when the MOD wanted plutonium from the newly opened Hinkley A, they issued a press release, and ministers in Parliament defended the deliberate public proliferation on economic benefit grounds. Today, the military-civil crossover and reinforcement of civil and military nuclear programmes has been deliberately obscured, and he thinks that UK energy ministers may not even realise the complexity of these machinations. He suspects that the lever pullers are in the Cabinet Office. Do you have any comments or thoughts on that?
You're muted, Andy.
Sorry, some special advisors now as well are playing a really strong role as well. I mean, thanks, David, for that comment. I mean, no, I don't think it's just to say, I don't think anyone has done more work over the years to really uncover these kinds of things. Not exactly the same thing Phil and I are working on now, but exactly the same kinds of things going back donkey's years as David has. And it's a really thankless and grueling work year after year to be doing that, because you don't make friends in high places when you do that kind of work. So thanks for all the work you've been doing on this, which Phil and I have benefited from hugely, David. And yeah, you're absolutely right. It's you really can't explain this international nuclear complex now. It's not even, I don't think, best understood as linkages. It is one thing. If archaeologists were to excavate our civilization in 1,000 years' time, they would not be able to distinguish between the nuclear infrastructures of the different major nuclear powers. They're ostensibly there to fight each other, but they're each now threatened by their own domestic politics more than they are by each other. They are there to perpetrate mass industrial violence against each other, but actually they're all worried about how can they get orders abroad if the nuclear thing plug is being pulled. And you see these really weird situations like, for instance, a British nuclear power station seriously being contemplated, being built, not just by a Chinese company, by the Chinese nuclear weapons company. So this is one infrastructure, I think, and that's why the destinies of each side of it are tied quite closely together.
Mm. Okay, thanks very much. The next one is from Linda Walker. Linda says, we've got to get all this great work you've done out into the campaigning world to change the minds of those climate campaigners who are saying they would rather not have nuclear power, but it has to be part of the mix. I've heard that a lot, obviously. Have any of you got ideas about how we can best publicise this link? Phil, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, well, thanks very much. It's great to hear. And I sympathize as well, because one of the things I've really struggled to understand now is that climate change argument, especially as time has gone on, and especially as we've heard people talking about the IPCC report in 2030, but yet still people make the argument that nuclear, which takes a long time to build and is very expensive, is somehow a solution. The evidence is clear that energy efficiency, renewables, is a much faster solution. And how can we get that argument out? Well, everyone can help, I suppose, whatever groups you're in, have discussions on this issue. And I suppose part of it is just, as Andy was saying earlier on, there does seem to be a disconnect in some ways between energy and questions of peace. And I suppose when it comes to movements and so on, it's just getting that conversation going again about talking about nuclear from the perspective of military, and not always beginning the conversation within the framework of nuclear proponents, which is it's about climate change. We need to start talking about nuclear again in a different way, and that's really how we can help. And obviously we're happy to participate in any events or whatever it is that you might be wanting to do. We're more than happy to help. So we're all open to suggestions as well, because this is something we've been thinking about, is how we could get this out. So yeah, very open to suggestions. So thanks.
Thanks. Phil, Andy?
Yeah, and just to build on that, I don't want to play to this conspiracy theory gallery, but it's not innocent either. It's really interesting. There is a striking difference between the way climate is campaigned on in countries like Germany, non-nuclear weapon states, and nuclear weapon states. Now, it's not a conspiracy, it's a political culture in the nuclear weapon states, tends to be affected by this sense of commitment to nuclear in that way. But it's not innocent that some protagonists in the climate debate are so strongly backing nuclear power. But you just look at the countries that have made greatest progress. We're going to have a paper come out shortly, a group of us at SPRU, which statistically analyzes the rate of progress made against climate disrupting emissions, a country by country basis, and just statistically analyze over 123 countries whether nuclear or renewables contribute more. The statistics are really clear. It's remarkable this hasn't been done before, that it's never been the case that nuclear has been principally justified by a climate argument. So I think one of the answers then to the question, which is a really great one, is just have the courage of the convictions. This is a really bogus argument backed by many honourable people make it. It's not that people are being cynical, but it is backed by very powerful interests who are putting it out there all the time to try and keep it going. And the press are pretty supine on questioning it. So have the courage of the convictions and really challenge it, because it's ridiculous now to claim that nuclear power is justified by climate change when it's so expensive and blocking resources to other options.
Thanks both on that. Next question is from Keith Scott. Did South Africa abolish nuclear power when it got rid of nuclear weapons? Anyone know?
No, it didn't.
No.
It's got Coburg nuclear power station, and it's looking to, and it's questionable. There's a lot of noise on these things, especially with Russian deals that tend to be pretty empty, but there's a lot of noise about following on. So the nuclear power side is alive and well in South Africa.
Okay.
Which is, by the way, a regional military power. It's another one of the patterns Phil pointed to, that among states like Iran, South Africa, Brazil, aspiring to regional status with explicit ideas about nuclear-propelled submarines, that's where you start hearing this fantasy world about new nuclear power stations.
Okay, thanks. Emma Howell is next. Emma says, does this link therefore mean that it is inevitable that Sizewell C is approved as well?
No, it is the simple answer. There's still, you know, things are getting very desperate for UK so-called nuclear renaissance. The challenge is for the UK government that there's very few organisations that really want to invest in nuclear anymore. So you've got EDF, you've got China, and we all know from the news recently the problems with that. Nuclear is getting increasingly expensive, so financing these plants is proving increasingly difficult. So there's nothing inevitable about it. These things can always be challenged. And I know there's a lot of work going on at Sizewell by activists who are really, from what I can see, you know, very well read and really on top of their game in challenging some of the claims that are being made at that local site. And, you know, everything's to play for. You know, the UK, a telling thing, I think, about the UK programme is that there's so many different elements to it. And that sort of, I think, attests to this desperation to try and get just something built, whatever it is. So whether it's small modular reactors or Hinkley C or Sizewell C or, you know, lots of different reactor designs, lots of high risk, but there's a desperation to try and secure that investment to sustain this supply chain. But just because that is a reason they're trying to do that in terms of the military does not mean it can't be challenged. And there are a lot of risks that mean Sizewell C does not inevitably have to go ahead, and it can be challenged. So yeah, that's the simple answer was no, and there's the long answer. So
or even Hinkley Point C, I'd say as well.
Dave, were you wanting to come in?
Well, just to say, you know, I think everybody here would encourage people to put objections forward to any of this kind of proposed building of new nuclear power stations. And I think many people may be put off because they think it's too technical, it's too difficult to understand. But I think you've just got to keep asking questions, keep asking the MPs, keep asking the ministers involved, just keep asking. And if you don't understand, keep asking until you do. Because mainly it's obscuration that's at foot here. It's people trying to make things sound more difficult than they really are, more complex than they really are, because they don't want ordinary people to be kind of involved in these kind of things. So it's important that we are involved and are aware of what's happening.
Thanks, Dave. Next question from Rebecca Warren. Rebecca says, why are the Trident subs nuclear propelled? There is not a direct link between the way the subs are propelled and the nuclear weapons they carry.
Yeah.
Why is that?
Well, there's not an engineering necessity. There's a cultural, the culture should not be underestimated. This nuclear engineering culture, this fascination with this concentration of power, both in the weapons and in the reactors, does play a role in conditioning the mindset that conceives of that kind of weapons platform. It's another element of the obsolescence we were quickly touching on earlier, and other people may know more about this again than we do, but there are new kinds of air-independent propulsion for submarines that are making nuclear propulsion more questionable now in its old heart ground of being silent, very long, allows you to go to sea for a long time, and have very large amounts of energy. There's other forms of propulsion that are allowing, for instance, Swedish submarines to be leased to the US and in exercises sink US aircraft carrier groups without being detected at all. So there's some really worrying for the military, the nuclear navy, signs of other technologies in propulsion, but they're not so good for ballistic missile platforms. These are for attack submarines, and it's not just, of course, the Trident submarines in the UK and the new generation that's being planned there. It's also the attack submarines, which are built, and it's explicit, and British have no submarines other than nuclear propelled submarines. And the reason for that is openly discussed in the defence literature. It's because that same thing that Phil and I are pointing to, the need to keep open the industrial base. If you want to build 4 ballistic missile submarines, which have a lifetime, they do, of 30 years plus or whatever it is, then you need that industry to keep going until you need a new next generation. If you're going to do that, you need every single submarine to be one of these gold-plated nuclear-propelled submarines. So that's the real logic. It's a political economy of keeping an industry open, which is exactly what we're saying has also contaminated energy policy as well. And it's very unclear why you would need nuclear-propelled attack submarines when you could get a whole bunch of the Swedish-style Stirling engine submarines to substitute that if you wanted to.
Okay, that's very interesting. Next question is from Kamal Kafoilu. He says, I would like to ask panelists about their opinion on nuclear fusion and if they would consider it as a safer, cleaner option than nuclear fission. Obviously, this technology is still in development, but I would like to find out if panelists and CND have a separate policy stroke view on this issue. Similarly, I do not know if nuclear fusion has the potential of leading to stronger nuclear weapons, and maybe panelists could share their knowledge on this matter too. And I would be very interested in your answer, because periodically people do email in to the CND office and raise the question of nuclear fusion. Phil, do you want to kick off on that?
I'll hand over to Andy on this one.
Okay.
Okay, well, chip in, Phil. Yeah, it's a good question, but I do think, I know it sounds, to give this kind of answer sounds unreflective, but it's something I and colleagues have thought about for a long time. The situation is not fundamentally different from fusion to fission. It's just that fusion has not yet made any impact whatsoever on energy production. Absolutely, it's absolutely nowhere near. In fact, it has been since the mid-50s that the rolling horizon for the commercialization of fusion power has been around 30 years. So for more than half a century, it's been a rolling 30-year horizon, as it is indeed now, and we're seeing a new hype. And you can explain these hypes not by reference to the actual success of the technology, which history has shown has been minimal. I mean, they're making progress, but they haven't achieved what they said they would achieve for more than half a century. What explains it is funding rounds and pressures like we're talking about, because just like nuclear expertise and skills, for nuclear weapons, you need fission expertise. Fusion expertise is the same kind of expertise in physics terms. And in relation to other things, I haven't got time to go into it, but although some of the problems are less acute, like actinides, long-lived radionuclides from irradiated nuclear fuel is quite a different thing, because it's a different nuclear reaction, the fusion reaction. Nonetheless, a neutron flux is there. So if you want to make nuclear weapons, and you're also creating a lot of intermediate level waste from the irradiation of materials. So you don't get rid of the nuclear waste problem, and you don't get rid of the nuclear proliferation problem, and you do sustain an industry whose only rationale in the end is nuclear weapons. And we have alternatives that are it's just amazing. They're so available in renewables. It's not a question of cost, because there is no cost for fusion, because it's not feasible. Okay, that's definitive. Dave, you want to come in there?
Well, I think Andy's covered it. Actually, I was going to say there is a big problem with high energy neutron flux that comes from nuclear fusion. And although that can be used, in fact, it can be used to generate plutonium for nuclear weapons, if that's what you want to do with it. It also needs to be contained somehow or other, or stopped, prevented. And, you know, I think Andy is right that you get these kind of cycles, which are kind of to do with the funding mechanisms that go with it. So when I was a student many years ago now, we were told that nuclear fusion was 25 years away. And as Andy again has said, it's been that all along. The 25 years is shifting and shifting. They're saying now that it's just around the corner, but they still need to get more energy out than they put into the whole process, and that hasn't happened yet. And I think the other question we have to ask is why? Why would we go for that? It's so expensive, it's so highly technical. Why would we do that when we've got renewables now coming up really cheaply, and there's just no need for it? So, you know, even if it works, it's not really necessary, it's not needed.
Okay, thanks very much. Someone's commenting on what you were saying about secrecy. They say, surely the secrecy occurred from the start and it's a continuation of that in a different form, if in a different form, yeah. And then Diana and Nick Francis, friends from Bath. Hello, Diana and Nick. Is there likely to be a reaction to Chinese investment in Hinkley C?
Yes, I mean, there is, we're seeing that reaction now, because obviously they're a minority investor in that project, and the idea is that the Chinese will retaliate if the Bradwell B is scrapped. And one way they could do that is by withdrawing their investment in other plants. And we're already seeing things like, it seems the only way you can get certain political parties, despite the economic problems and despite all the problems with nuclear, the only thing that seems to get them going is the threat of China. And we've even seen conservative politicians coming out and saying, we need to watch this. But, you know, that already you're seeing the sort of other side, where I've seen proposals by government that they could take a golden share to protect the Chinese investment. And, you know, we've already heard talk that they could sort of state fund that gap in the funding if that occurred. So, you know, if China did pull out, I think we'd be likely to see even more eccentric financial moves on the part of the British government to try and protect that investment. And ultimately that would be at the behest of the British taxpayers. So we need to keep an eye on that closely.
Okay, thanks very much. We've just got time for a few more questions. I think some people are going to be disappointed, but let's plough ahead. Linda Pence-Guntner. Hi, Linda. She says, absolutely right, Andy. Would you like to talk about why countries like Saudi Arabia would want nuclear power, given its climate, sunny and windy? It's clearly a pathway to nuclear weapons, right? And allowed by Article 4 of the NPT, giving the inalienable right to countries who disavow nuclear weapons to develop nuclear power. The reason, as you say, that the NPT is the problem. Any further comments on that, Andy?
Linda put it really well. I mean, and it really just, it's worth reflecting on this, because one gets influenced, even when one is a critic, sort of one's identity is, you know, over many years doggedly conditioned that way. It's absolutely amazing that we live in a society where the mainstream media and serious debate doesn't just laugh and ridicule what's happening in a country like UAE or Saudi Arabia or indeed Iran, which are endowed with multiple alternatives. Obviously the oil is completely unacceptable for climate reasons, but it doesn't make sense politically. It's that the link between this nuclear power technology and nuclear weapons is so clear that we have to really reflect on the kind of societies we live in. And I say that because I think without doing that, we won't solve this problem, without really realizing how deeply corrupted political debate has been generally on energy policy by the need not to just obviously acknowledge a dynamic like that is quite a big issue. And I am a bit worried about the securitization angle as well. You know, the angle about challenging, for instance, Bradwell, because the Chinese state, the nuclear weapons infrastructure is involved. We have to be careful what we wish for. If we use that as an argument against nuclear power, we're stoking this sort of fear-driven military politics at the same time. So it can work, but it can also be dangerous.
Okay. So going on to the international framework now, Kenneth says, I now live in France and I'm astonished to find that anti-nuclear movements here focus almost exclusively on nuclear power generation, and the force to frappe, that's France's nuclear weapons, is never mentioned. How can this be? Any thoughts on the situation, campaigning situation in France?
Phil?
Well, it's a very good question. Again, it's a shame that it's the case, because I mean, it's, if anything, a lot more out in the open in France. One of the statements we came across in terms of this civil military link, I mean, one of the statements we came across was in Le Monde, and this statement basically said that if France makes the decision to reduce its nuclear power capacity, which has been proposed, then there's the risk that France will also lose its military nuclear power. So the links are very clear, and you know, it's a shame that it hasn't been made more amplified. I don't know the background as to why that is. Maybe France doesn't have such a commendable sort of organization as CND is here, or something to challenge these issues. But I think it's certainly something that is if anything more out in the open than it is in the UK, and should be challenged. So yeah.
Andy, and then I also want to ask Dave to comment on this as well after. So Andy?
Just to add, despite the many differences, the basic pattern in France is very similar to UK. You know, a pre-colonial power trying to maintain its position on the world stage by possessing a few nuclear weapons to basically perpetrate deterrent or terror on other countries. It's the same basic dynamic, and it's a national identity. And Nicolas Hulot, the former minister in France, there was a whole scandal which wasn't fully illuminated but was discussed in the French media, that there was a report commissioned for him on he intended to scale back massively French nuclear power, and this report came out of the nuclear establishment saying if you do that, the force de frappe will be threatened. That's what Le Monde and other papers describe. So a very similar dynamic in France, a real reluctance to concede the issues, and a national identity hinging on these things, a bit like it does in the UK.
Dave, you work closely with the French peace movement. Any comments?
Yes, I think there have been in the past in France two separate movements, one against nuclear power, one against nuclear weapons, and they haven't really connected. I think for historical reasons, I'm not really sure why, but that's not the case now. Movement de la Paix, who are a major peace movement in France and are very active, they are kind of like the CND equivalent, and friends of ours, we work with them when we can. They are now also campaigning against nuclear power too, because they recognize the dangers of nuclear power and also the connections with the nuclear weapons industries too. So I think it's changing and becoming much more clear that this connection needs to be challenged.
Okay, well, our time is up, so apologies to the 10 or so questioners that haven't had an answer, but I'm just going to ask you if you'd each say, you know, in just about a minute, something like that, any suggestions for how we as either individuals or as CND members and activists in our local groups, how we can be most effective in campaigning on this. Andy, would you like to go first?
Well, yeah, thank you so much for this invitation. And I would say just keep on doing what you're doing. Keep being CND. Be proud of that tradition that goes back longer than anyone, making these links when so many other organizations have dropped the ball, and just keep on doing the same thing. Just now is a moment, probably the whole history of these technologies, interlinked technologies, when the chances are greatest over the coming decade. So yes, thank you for everything you've done. Please carry on doing it, because I think you know, there's a genuine prospect of changing not only the UK, but changing the world dynamic around this technology. So let's hope.
Thanks very much. Phil?
Yeah, similar lines really, and I think it comes back to an earlier point about just getting that point out there about the military connection, to not be, I mean, I've spent an unfortunate amount of time on Twitter, and you know, you can get intimidated almost by some of the material that's put to you by very pro-nuclear people, and you know, they're sending photos of the French nuclear scale-up in the 1970s as evidence of what we should do now, and saying that you don't care about climate change and all these things. It must be resisted, you know, don't listen to it. On climate grounds, nuclear is not a solution. Be clear in that, and let's talk about nuclear in the context of what it was and what it in many ways continues to be, which is a military technology. And let's speak about it in those terms, and be brave in speaking about it in those terms, and not be put off by the often kind of unpleasant things you can encounter on Twitter and so on. So yeah, thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks very much. Dave?
Well, just to say thank you, Andy and Phil, for the work that you've done and for the work that you'll continue to do, I'm sure. I mean, we do need people like you to dig out the things that we can then use and follow up with questions, and because these things do need to be seriously questioned, seriously challenged, and it will be up to us to do it, up to us, the people, up to us citizens to do that. So thanks ever so much, and carry on doing what you're doing. That's brilliant.
Mm. And can I add my thanks? And I hope I won't be overstepping the mark if I say that maybe if our groups would like to invite you to speak, for example, on this theme in a local group meeting, maybe they could contact the office and we could forward those requests to you. Is that possible?
Of course.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, lovely. Thank you very much indeed. So, well, thanks everyone for joining us today. Thanks to Andy, Phil and Dave, and it's been really fantastic. So bye-bye and see you at the next webinar, I hope. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.